have any awareness of being even different, even though everyone else was black or white and we were Chinese. It didn't mean a whole lot to me. So when I was a kid, I just thought I was a kid. I didn't know there was a whole world out there of Chinese in California or New York and Chinatowns. I mean, we ate Chinese food. My mom cooked Chinese style, but I never ate in a Chinese restaurant because there were no Chinese restaurants there. The only place you could eat Chinese food was in my mother's house. So I was just like a little town, small town boy, just kind of, figuring out what was going on in that world. It wasn't until I moved to San Francisco when I was 15 that I suddenly became more aware of some of these other issues. Now, I never really learned from my father very much about his arrival or his history in America until much later. And partly that was because he didn't tell me, he didn't talk about it, and partly because I never asked him. But I did learn a lot from my mother. My mother was the one who sort of taught me all these things about our family history. I didn't ask all the questions I should have asked or I wish I could have asked at the time, but so part of what I've been doing in recent years is trying to piece all this together, because when I first moved to California and people would find out that I came from Georgia, they would all look incredulous and say, well, how'd you get there? So to me, that was a stupid question. I said, well, I was there because my parents were there and I was born there. I mean, well, why are you asking me, how I got there? It seems kind of elementary. But I didn't go much further beyond that at that point. But now, as I start to think about it, my father came over as an immigrant from Guangdong in 1921. And I tried to imagine myself in his shoes, just getting off the boat and not having much command of the English language. How would he know where to go? How would he know how to get there? Even if someone said, come to Georgia, where do you get the train? How do you buy a ticket? It's quite an intimidating kind of thing. I don't know that I would have been able to negotiate that. So all those immigrants who went to the hinterlands became a question of interest to me. Is how do they get there? And also, why do they go there? So those are some of the things that I want to address. Like, why would my parents, of all places in the United States, go to Georgia? As I said, I never asked exactly how they got there. I know they got there. They went there pretty much directly from San Francisco to Georgia. And when they went there, maybe they knew somebody. I didn't know that as a child, who they knew. But I also kind of wondered, what certainty did they have that when they got there, they'd have a way of making a living? So this is based on census figures from 1870. So if you look at the United States, there weren't very many Chinese outside the West Coast, and maybe up in New York, and like maybe parts of New England. See, Georgia, there's zero. Those numbers are not like thousands or hundreds. Like Alabama had 4 Chinese that they could determine, Now there might have been a few others hiding. Look at this guy in North Carolina, just one of them there, okay? So after 1870, a lot of things started to change. And I want to talk about some of these issues about why 1870 and the decades after that, there was this increasing move to the hinterlands. So, as an organizing way, I'm going to describe like maybe 3 or 4 basic ways. I use the word escorted kind of loosely because it's succinct and I can't think of a better term. But it's like you're a tourist. You could go on a guided tour. You could pay a fee and have someone take you there and show you where to get the bus or the plane or the train and get your meals for you and find a place where you stay. Or you can go unescorted, maybe not in a group, or maybe in a small group, maybe by yourself. And then you can say that you're guided from the distance. Someone somewhere in the hinterlands is sending for you and giving you instructions. Now there's some different combinations of these, but just as an organizing principle, I'm going to talk about these 3 give examples of these three major methods that I delineated. Labor contractors are really important in our history. It took me a long time to realize this. I mean, I had read about them, but I really didn't think about them too much until I started realizing how difficult it would be for individual Chinese immigrants to find their way to the hinterland. So a labor contractor could be Chinese, it could be Caucasian. They would be people who are in the business of going and signing up people for a job. So let's say you need 100 laborers to come and build a levee. You need 100 laborers to come and work on building a bridge. So where are you going to find them? So you go to an agency, the labor contractor. The labor contractor has connections and goes and arranges for these 100 laborers to come either from China or from different parts of the United States. And that contractor is responsible for bringing and delivering those laborers to your site. And you pay them a fee, and then out of that commission, you pay the room and board and travel for your laborers. Your laborers don't need to know where they're going. They just need to show up on time, to get on the bus or get on the train and go. So here's a picture of a influential labor contractor in Seattle. Also, the Chinese 6 companies also were involved in recruiting. So you got people to work on canneries, you got people to work in factories, and the labor contractor is the middleman. He's the one who knows where the jobs are. He's the one who goes and recruits the people, and he delivers the individuals there. So one of the prominent people was actually of Dutch extraction, Cornelius Koopmanschap. And he was very influential in helping get laborers to work on the railroad, Transcontinental Railroad. He also later was very instrumental in trying to bring some Chinese to the Deep South in the Mississippi Delta region to work on plantations, which he was not very successful in doing, actually. But and he actually went bankrupt eventually. But he was one of the major prominent labor contractors. So I just give you a few other examples. Okay, so I already kind of mentioned that. Okay, and there was an article in the New York Times, 1869, and talking about what he would do. He would be able to help bring these industrious people over to work in the fields and farms, and so this is just basically describing, what services he could offer and what the benefits would be. There were also Caucasians in San Francisco. One of the prominent labor contractor companies or businesses was, had an ad placed, and you can see it's bilingual. They contracted Chinese to work in the logging industry. Logging industry is very important for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the railroad, because you can't build a railroad without having timber, for building the slats or whatever you call them underneath the rails. And this is in Seattle. They had a lot of these, actually merchants as well as labor contractors. In other words, they have a store, and so they would be qualified under the Exclusion Act to be in the United States because they were selling goods such as tea, porcelain, maybe in some cases opium, because it was legal until about 1913 or 1914. So there were various silks, things that white Americans would want. So you have this store, and on the side you also have this recruiting agency or labor contracting business. So these people were all very successful, very prosperous, but without them, they would never have been able to find 10,000, that's a round figure estimate, of Chinese laborers to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. you need labor contractors to work that out for you. This is more close to home. That building still exists in the old Chinatown, which is probably only 2 buildings left in San Luis Obispo. And there's a plaque there on the side honoring Alui, who had the store. He was also a labor contractor who provided workers for railroads in California. Okay, so as we see, one of the major things, probably the first thing, was the railroad, Transcontinental Railroad, which was built in the mid-1860s. And as you probably all know from publicity now, 1869 was the year it was finished. Now, and so you have these over 10,000 Chinese, and on a certain day, more or less, the railroad's completed. What are these people going to do? They're all unemployed. You got 10,000 people looking for work. Now, fortunately, I guess you could say, there was a time period where they could find other work, because what did they know how to do? They knew how to build railroads. So it's not mentioned in the, because the Transcontinental Railroad dominates. You have all these little small regional railroads, some in the Pacific Northwest, some as far as in this case in Memphis, one in Alabama, Houston and Texas Central. I think there was one somewhere in Virginia, or Baltimore and Ohio. So you have these railroads on the other part of the country, and you're having some of these Chinese who finished working on the Transcontinental Railroad. They had no jobs, but they had the experience to build railroads, so they gravitated or moved or recruited to these other parts of the hinterland, which they were quite unfamiliar with. So this is an important transition period for these workers. Now eventually, when those railroads got completed, then you had this other problem. Then what are they going to do? But we'll get to that in a minute. And just some other illustrations. This is up in the Pacific Northwest in Astoria, Oregon. Labor contractor recruited Chinese to work in the canneries. This is in 1870 in North Adams, Massachusetts. There were these these workers in a shoe factory in North Adams, Massachusetts. And they wanted higher wages and better working conditions. And so they went on strike. So rather than give in to the strike, the owner, he said, well, I heard these Chinese work pretty hard and they're pretty reliable, and they'll also work for less money. So he sent in a request for a labor contractor to send them somewhere of the order of about 100 Chinese young men who all went to North Adams. This is a photograph of the workers out in front of the factory. This is a kind of a drawing of their eating space. Here's some other magazine pictures of trying to illustrate what it looked like inside the shoe factory. Now, Chinese were actually making shoes in California as well, San Francisco. Now, how much this influenced their interest in that, I'm not quite sure. Well, these were just parallel developments. St. Crispin was the, I guess, patron saint of the white workers at that factory, and so there was this cartoon put in trying to politicize this issue that the Chinese were basically attacking St. Crispin, the martyrdom of St. Crispin. This is to represent the Chinese taking over the shoe factory. Actually, the Chinese only worked there for a few years, and then they left. Exactly where they went, no one knows entirely. There's not good records of that, but that was one of these experiences. Several others that are very notable. Hearing of the success in North Adams, a white laundry owner in Belleville, New Jersey, decided he would follow the lead set in the shoe factory. So he went and got himself somewhere of the order of, I think, 73 Chinese workers to come from the West Coast to replace the striking white workers in the Belleville laundry. And some people even think that at that time, there were not an extremely large number of Chinese laundries, and some of these Chinese workers' laundry kind of learned the ropes there, and then proceeded to open a lot of their own laundries on the East Coast, or in the environs of New Jersey. Yes.
Switch mics.
Oh.
Okay.
All right, and is it on? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So in the South, meanwhile, because of the plantations needing labor, especially after slavery ended, the idea was there were Chinese who were hard workers, and they had come from an agricultural situation in Guangdong, and so they recruited Chinese to work there. And again, in all of these situations, the Chinese did not stay long. A lot of them didn't like working out in the fields, and they found other ways of earning a living. This is actually a cutlery factory in Pennsylvania, and it's the same thing. The white workers said, we want more money, we're going to go on strike. Okay, go on strike. We'll just get some Chinese to replace you. So, you see, these are all in the early 1870s. And so what's significant is that we don't know for sure, but could some of these workers who were recruited, could they have been brought in originally from China, maybe to work on the railroad? And then after they worked on peripheral railroads, and that work ended, maybe they would be able to find work through a labor contractor as a strikebreaker. So in a way, this created a real problem. You had those 10,000 Chinese working on the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay, good, they got the railroad built. The white tycoons made a lot of money off of it. And then it kind of backfired in the sense that you had all these unemployed Chinese who were then scrounging for work, drifting around the country, working for low wages, and then becoming condemned as cheap labor stealing jobs from white people. So it's a familiar argument that the Chinese were taking work that other people didn't want to do, but then they're being condemned for stealing or taking away jobs. Okay, now a different type of export to the hinterlands is a category of what we call domestic servitude, or in common terms, hapsing, houseboy. You're not building a railroad, you're not making shoes, you're in somebody's house cooking, looking after the children, doing the house clothing, and so domestic servitude, they felt the Chinese were very obedient, docile. They'd be happy to have that position in a home, and they'd have a housing and they'd have food, and so there became an interest in recruiting and bringing Chinese, not by the thousands, but in some small number, into other parts of the country. So they weren't relegated just to the West Coast. You would have people all over the country interested in having a Chinese servant or houseboy in your residence. So one of the groups that were responsible for this, there were white missionaries, and there were in the United States churches who were interested in rescuing the Chinese from their situation in China. And so they thought, we could bring these Chinese over to the United States and put them into domestic service. So this is just a little excerpt from a book by a man named Andrew Urban called Brokering Servitude. It came out a couple of years ago. And it says that these Chinese who wish to open laundries, restaurants, or other businesses transition from household service to service where they control the means of production. So what he's saying here is that you had these Chinese brought over to serve as domestic help. Eventually, and that was a benefit to this, and that over other Chinese who, say, lived in Chinatown, they were able to learn English because they lived in an American home. They also got benefits from if their people who hired them had some influence, some money they could help them with their immigration problems. And so that's kind of a side issue. But the main issue that's brought up here is that these Chinese were dispersed all around the country because they were recruited by missionaries who were in China. They had a servant in China. They come back to the United States. They go to all parts of the United States. They don't just go to the West Coast. They're in Kansas, they're in Missouri, they're in Illinois. And so we're getting Chinese spread out more and more in different parts of the country where they might not have gone on their own because they wouldn't know how to get there, and then what would they do? This is an excerpt from a letter that some church sent to the immigration or whoever the authorities were. I don't know, immigration or what, but who was responsible for approving admission of Chinese, especially after the exclusion law passed in 1882. We desire to bring a bright boy, 12 years old, now in the mission school in China. We want to educate him here, and he can learn our methods and then return to his native land and advance his people in education and religion. In fact, in all things he can toward advancing his people in great reforms that they so much need. Okay, so the white savior makes a judgment that, China's a mess. We got this bright kid. Let us bring him to the United States and we'll teach him all these things, and then we'll let him go back to China and he'll be a benefit to China. Whether that is entirely the case that they would do this, we don't know, but that's the argument that's made. So they want to make some argument. They have to make a request to get approval to bring this child over. This is just one example, but it kind of typifies the way of thinking of the white benevolence toward the heathen Chinese. Now, this again, you can't splotch this at the bottom, but it's the same thing. It's not a church in this case, but it could be a particular family, a family who would have been in China previously, or maybe had never been to China, but just had heard about this. Hey, we can go and get some reliable help in our home to help bring up the children, to do the cooking, and do other household chores. Now, there was always a problem of whether these servants would stay. What's to prevent these servants, once they get admitted into the country, working for a while and then leaving and deciding that, I can find better paying work somewhere else. So that was always a concern. How do you regulate and control this? Usually, if they brought in Chinese as a as a domestic servant, the sponsor would have to pay like a $500 surety bond to show that they had some willingness to pay this. It's sort of like you forfeit this money if this domestic suddenly becomes an undocumented immigrant. So eventually, domestic servants became so popular, you didn't see ads in the newspaper wanted a Chinese servant in a small family. This article, which you can't read, but basically it says that these Chinese are getting very demanding. He said, we tried to interview this Chinese to be a servant, and he wanted to know, like, what are the hours, and how many, do I have to do this, and I do have to do that? In other words, it's a seller's market now. Before, they were just eager to be a domestic servant. Now, they're being choosy. Why should I work for you? The guy down the street is going to give me more money or give me better working circumstances. So, one interesting irony is that when they passed the Exclusion Act, because the white working union didn't want the Chinese here because they were taking away jobs. On the other hand, people who had families, they were upset. And you can see at the bottom, it says, the Chinese must come. In other words, we don't want them excluded, because if you exclude them, we can't find any to be serving in our homes. So this cartoon, all these women are welcoming these Chinese immigrants because they want to recruit them to do the cooking and house chores. So there's a contradiction here in a way. On the one hand, the country says in 1882, Chinese can't come, and we won't let them work in the factories because they work for less. But the cartoon here shows some woman, you can't read it, but she's complaining, that she can't get help. And the word is a hit on the Chinese question. So it says, we'll let them come if they'll work in the house, because they're not really getting competitive, they're not competing for wages against white people. White people generally would not want to be a servant in someone else's house. Probably maybe the notable exception was like in New York, there were the group that was like just above the Chinese were the Irish. So the Irish domestics were, the biddies as they called them, were being replaced by the Chinese servants. So there was a little bit of a racial competition there. So questions of some importance come up, especially if we're talking about the 1870s. It's not that long after slavery was abolished. So the American ideology was, people should be free, and slavery is outlawed. But if Chinese servants are not slaves, are they free? Are they free labor? Or are they, in essence, coolies? Are they, in essence, indentured servants? And so, under some conditions, probably they were free. Maybe other households, they were sort of treated sort of like almost as if they were slaves. They had no independence. They had no freedom of movement. So they were sort of trapped in those circumstances. So this is talking about legal marginalization as the migrants are barred from naturalizing, because Chinese were not allowed to become naturalized citizens. So they're looking at how allowing Chinese immigrants to do work labeled menial and unworthy of citizenship linked the continued employment of Chinese servants to the West Coast's advantages on labor. So people were concerned about this. There were differences of opinion as to whether American values were consistent or having Chinese servants working in that capacity were consistent with American values of freedom. And here it makes mention, we'll let them come in with servants so long as they take out surety bonds that indemnified the government against the possibility Chinese servants might leave their service and remain on an undocumented or unauthorized basis. So those are some of the, I guess you'd say, political, philosophical issues that having the servant raised. But the point also being that this is how a lot of Chinese got into Middle America, into the vast hinterlands. They would have never gone there or found their way there on their own. Someone had to bring them there, and these people who hired them as their domestic servants helped spread Chinese across the hinterlands. Okay, so that's the same point. Now, another way of being exported to the hinterlands, and this is quite different from being hired as a domestic, this would be the concern about smuggling. And there were a lot of cases, certainly in the late 1800s and early 1900s, of smuggling rings coming in through various coastal places, either crossing through Mexico, coming through New Orleans, coming through Norfolk, Virginia, coming across the Canadian border. All those borders were porous, and Chinese, instead of trying to go through, say, after 1910, going through Angel Island, they found it easier just to go and cross a border at some, isolated place. And so, obviously, if they were captured, they would be deported. We don't know exactly what the success rate was, but obviously there were a number who did succeed in getting smuggled across. And I've read some documents about some of these cases. All right, and here is an expose where they discovered that some Chinese in Chicago had a smuggling ring. And you can see little clips there, that there was a restaurant in Chicago that they found some records that led them to investigate Mobile, Alabama, which is on the Gulf of Mexico, that Chinese paying $250 a head in those days were being brought across into the United States in Mobile. Some of those may have come from Cuba, but we don't know, but that's that kind of speculation just in terms of proximity. Now, another form of entry would be what I call a sponsored entry. In other words, you're not being hired to work on the railroad, you're not being smuggled in, you're not a domestic servant, but somehow you are connected to someone who is already here. They're not all in the hinterlands. I'm only speaking about how those who got to the hinterlands, like my father did. He would have been, quote, sponsored. But somebody that he knew, from China probably, said, oh, we want you to come to our area to work with us and to help us in our business or whatever. Now, the problem being that, as you know, if you were a laborer, you could not enter after 1882. So the way around this was for your father, or if not your father, somebody to claim to be your father, so that you, otherwise you say you claim to be the son, so you're the paper son, or in some cases the daughter. But that was rare because most of the immigrants were men or male. So Chinese would have to show documentation and witnesses to convince the immigration officers that you indeed were the son of this particular person. And in many cases they weren't. But it might be the case that someone in China has a son who doesn't want to come. So he sells his papers to someone else whose son does want to come, or whose father wants to bring his son over. Or you could have some made-up slots. Person goes back to China for a visit, comes back, reports having fathered a child. Now, maybe 10 years later or 12 years later, you could sell those papers to some other family who has a 12-year-old boy who otherwise kind of fits more or less the description of the legitimate, or what would be the legitimate son, but you actually have another person coming in. So in any case, the point being that there were some Chinese who were scattered all around the United States who wanted to bring over other male relatives to help in their business. And so you would have to make a statement like this. This is a document where there's a person who's a merchant. He submits an affidavit that, and a photograph that this is my son, he's in China, I want to bring him over. I'm a merchant, I'm entitled to bring immediate family members over. I could bring my children or my wife, I could petition to bring them over. Now, the authorities, being wise to the fact that a lot of these were fraudulent claims, that these were not in fact their biological offspring or wife, would scrutinize these applicants very intensively with their interrogations, which run hundreds of pages or thereabouts of very detailed descriptions trying to disqualify the applicant, because if they don't know details about the village or the house in which they allegedly came from, then they would be accused of being not that person and then denied entry. So one of the things that you had to do if you were the merchant, not only did you have to send an affidavit saying you wanted to bring in the child, you'd also have to have testimony from 2 witnesses, preferably white. And these people literally took the phrase, I have never seen so-and-so, the alleged merchant, do any labor, anytime I've seen him. Doesn't mean he was just sitting around, lolling around, drinking coffee. But, I didn't see him out there doing serious manual labor. So that's a document of that sort. So my father, when he came over in 1921, he had his immigration papers, and this is just one page out of about 100 pages, typed on onion skin, where they asked him all these questions. I know you can't read the questions, but just as a sample, he actually was able successfully to come in as a paper son, even though when I read the documents in the archives of San Bruno for the first time, I was wondering how he got in. Because there were at least 5 or 6 times where the interrogator would basically say, however, your alleged father says otherwise. And when I read that, I got extremely nervous. But then I was reassured because I knew my father did get in. But I was thinking at that moment, were they bluffing? Were they just saying that, or was that really true? This is just my guess. I noticed that my father never changed the story. Anytime they said, oh, but your alleged father says something quite different, my father always said, well, I'm just telling you what I remember. So anyway, he managed to get in. So with women, like in the case of my mother, this is a part of a page. The questions basically deal with moral character. Do you believe in polygamy? Do you believe in anarchy? Have either of your parents been insane? Do you believe a female person has the right to have 2 husbands at the same time? Okay, so those are the kind of questions that they ask that they would not have asked of the men, quite obviously. So it became this great concern about Chinese women being brought in to work in prostitution. Now, we should point out that some of the worst offenders were not Caucasians. The Chinese profited a lot by bringing in sex slaves, I mean girls or women who they forced into slavery as prostitutes. Oh, here's a newspaper article, slave girls being landed as native daughters. In other words, just as we talk about paper sons, we talk about paper daughters. Okay, so you have these Chinese merchants who have some influence. They go and recruit some young girls. They might say, oh, we have a good prospect. There's a young man, Chinese man in I don't know, Albuquerque. He's got a lot of money and he's looking for a wife. So why don't you come over and we'll set you up and you'll be married and you'll have a lot of money and you can send money back to your parents. So the young girl agrees to go, but she has to, have these fake papers saying that she's the daughter of so-and-so. So that's what we call landed as a native daughter or paper daughter. So here's an interesting case. This has nothing to do with sex slaves per se, but this is an article I found where a man married a young woman, and when he wanted to bring her into the country, she was denied admission because they thought that she had been purchased in China and was coming over to continue her life of slavery. There was no evidence that she was. Apparently, according to the article, that was, his wife. He was wanting to bring his wife in, but somehow in those days, there weren't that many women coming over anyway. So once they decided that she was being brought over for prostitution, then they denied her entry. Okay, so as I said, if you were a wife or daughter of a Chinese merchant, not of a laborer, you were allowed by the 1882 law to come in, provided you can prove who you are, that you say you are. Chinese Tongs actually imported women in false marriages, as I alluded to before, and then they would auction them off. So one startling statistic was that in a 20-year span, one Tong trafficked 6,000 women, and they made $200,000, which was a lot of money in those days, obviously. Here's a headline from some paper, a Chinese slave market in the city of San Francisco. In this one case, they were just reporting 19 Chinese women are sold at a public auction. Okay? So, in addition to those types of concerns, there were some other broader issues of attitudes about Chinese. What were white Americans afraid of about the Chinese? So in this illustration, you see the Chinese is really aggressive, hostile. He's got a knife, he's got a gun, and there's a woman lying there on the ground. I guess she's been attacked or killed or whatever. So in San Francisco, particularly, where there were a lot of Chinese all crowded into the Chinatown ghetto, which was not by choice, that they were not allowed to live anywhere else. So it's kind of hard to decide, you know, did they choose to live there, or did they live there for safety, or were they not allowed to live in other parts of the town? When I moved to San Francisco in 1952, most Chinese still lived within a block or two of the old Chinatown. They were not allowed to buy property, or maybe not allowed is too strong a word, but it seems that there were very few Chinese living west of Van Ness Avenue, you know, San Francisco. They were all still kind of huddled together in the old Chinatown. So anyway, this article talks about, you know, leprosy, venereal disease. It doesn't use that term, but that opium pipes handled by those already afflicted from these houses of prostitution that are growing, and the bottom part you can't say. See, it's destroying our youth and everything. So they're worried about getting contagious diseases from the Chinese, leprosy, and so forth. There was also a lot of concern about opium dens, which there were, and various magazines and pulp fiction of the day had series with these graphic depictions of the dangers of being caught in Chinatown in the throes of some of these evil Chinese people. Then there was a big concern about Chinese having sexual relations or being married to white women. In this case, it's called holding up a highbinder. That presumably is his Irish wife or girlfriend. I don't know why he has to be held up, but highbinder is like a gangster or whatever. But that's how he's being depicted. So there were laws in Canada as well as the United States for a period of time. White women could not work in a Chinese restaurant. They didn't want mingling, you know, where there could be a risk of some sort of sexual liaison. Here's a newspaper article. Headline says, laundryman and Inglewood young woman soon to be married. Chop suey restaurants blamed. In other words, it wasn't anything in the chop suey. It was the fact that, you know, they were in the kitchen together, and instead of cooking the chop suey, you know, some hanky-panky was going on. And they quote the mother, okay, well, the mother who couldn't stand to have a celestial for a son-in-law, they were called celestials in the mid-1800s. The bride's parents packed their trunks last night, prepared to remove to New York with their remaining children. In other words, they couldn't stand to be there. Here's a sad case of where there was this suspicion that the white wife had been killed. Her death was suspicious. She was married to a Chinese man. This is a less celebrated case. In 1909 or thereabouts, there was the Elsie Siegel case. She was a white girl in her 20s. She went down to the mission school to help teach English to Chinese immigrants. And then they found her dead in the steamer trunk that was located in the living quarters of one of these Chinese men. And so there was a manhunt for this guy. And he was seen everywhere. They saw him in Missouri. They saw him in Oregon. They saw him. Anytime someone saw a Chinese man, like in his 20s, oh, there he is. You know, he really moves around fast. You know, but that really cemented this fear of these Chinese men for white women. Chop Suey King sued by his American bride. This is a case of a marriage that didn't end in murder, but some form of divorce. Okay, so anyway, they dubbed the guy the Chop Suey King. Oh yeah, and the woman says after she sued him, she said, "I'm glad to hear that they're not going to allow any more Chinamen into this country. hunting for a job to be a waitress. Okay, so she wasn't satisfied just to sue him anyway. So around this time, you know, in the 1880s now, this is like a follow-up and a continuation of the Exclusion Act, intensified in the Northwest, Tacoma, Eureka, California, Seattle, and also in Nevada. I think, I don't know, it was, what's the town in Idaho, starts with a T. I'm blocking on it right now, but anyway. Huh?
Idaho?
No, in Nevada, just across the border.
Truckee. Tahoe.
Oil company. Truckee, near Sacramento. Truckee. Is it in, oh, it's near Colorado. Maybe they're, okay. So, as y'all know, before there was Trump, there was the Chinese Wall, okay? I don't know if Trump has seen this particular diagram or not, but whether that will encourage him or discourage him anyway. So this is what, you know, political cartoons look like in the, you know, late 1800s.
Microphone.
Oh, okay, sorry, yeah. So, because of all this growing animosity and all these things building up, they finally, you know, ended up with this Exclusion Act, which continued for quite a number of years, being renewed every 10 years for a while. All right, so that then intensified the violence. All the little dots represent major violence against Chinese. You can see it mostly on the West Coast and up in Idaho. There was one in Wyoming that I know of. The one in Rock Springs, Wyoming, was quite atrocious one. Quite a few Chinese were killed. So the message is simple, okay? You have a choice. What would you rather do, okay? So that kind of says it all, Oregon. This is Rock Springs, Wyoming, artist rendition of the slaughter and some mine where Chinese were brutally expelled. Seattle's riot, leaving out LA's massacre, because you're all familiar with that. And it wasn't probably as big a scale as these anyway. San Jose, so there are places all down the coast, Eureka, Tacoma. So we talk about an unescorted movement to the hinterlands. Okay, so you didn't have someone take you there, someone give you a guide to it. You were running for your life. I mean, you were saying, we can't stay in this town in California anymore. It's too dangerous. We need to move east or south or somewhere to find a place where they'll leave us alone. So contrary to the saying of safety in numbers, it almost seems like if you're the only one in town, maybe they won't see you as big a threat. Maybe they won't notice you. Maybe they'll leave you alone and treat you as an individual. I'm not saying that's their actual reasoning that went on, but in some degree, in some towns that did occur, especially if you look 100 years later. You find a lot of these small towns that are having memorials, positive testimonials about these Chinese laundrymen who were here 100 years ago, what wonderful citizens they were. And even before they got there, in some towns they would write articles and say, oh boy, we're having a Chinese restaurant coming to our town, hurrah, hurrah, kind of thing. So you had to decide where to go. And sometimes, you just ended up somewhere, wherever you had enough money to go to, or maybe if you knew someone. But more importantly is then, what are you going to do when you get there? Okay, so maybe you're safer, but you still got to have some work, okay? So in the 1870s, these were the main sources of employment for Chinese. Notice how high domestic servants are. There were more people, Chinese people, serving as domestic servants than there were as laundrymen. Laundrymen was number 4. Launderers and laundresses, 3,000. Domestic servants, 5,000. Okay, so some of those jobs, kind of, I'm quite sure what some of the, okay, peddlers, tailors, all and so forth. Okay, so the main thing that they got into first was laundries. As early as 1860s, you started seeing them, and certainly 1870 and 1880, they started popping up. And this was partly because this was uncontested. Nobody likes to do laundry. If you had a domestic servant, your domestic servant did laundry. In the West, where there were a lot of people who were adventurers and so forth, they didn't have families, where are they going to do laundry? So Chinese sort of fell in that category, and they became stereotyped by that. So they got the dominance for a while until white steam laundries came along in the early 1900s. So here are just a couple of depictions of that some photographers have shown, which I can attest to are quite accurate renditions of kind of difficult lives or lonely, tiring, exhausting, dead-end jobs working laundry. And adding insult to injury, whites would often mock the Chinese with cartoons, making it look almost like frivolous, that this is sheet music, and this is the cover of the sheet music called No Washi Tu Te, and supposedly long sing laundry. This products, manufacturing things like bleach and bluing and so forth for Chinese laundries. They often use Chinese as the stereotypical prototype for those. This is an interesting picture. Some of you may know Kevin Han Yi, the actor. This is part of his relatives in Santa Barbara. It was kind of interesting because I know him, but I didn't know these were his relatives. I found this picture from Santa Barbara. So what's interesting about this picture is obviously they're all older men. They're all maybe sitting together, having a meal together. What this means to me is you're not going to have that many Chinese men working in one laundry, that's for sure. This is probably Sunday. These Chinese have been working from morning to night, 6 days a week. On Sunday, all Chinese within 50 or 100 miles will congregate at some central place just for a meal or to gamble or smoke opium or do whatever they do and talk about the old country. I remember going to Atlanta with my father and seeing the same thing happen there. There are these rooms of just Chinese men sitting there. They have no place to go. They have no families with them, or very few, maybe one or two, no children. And so this is their way of maintaining some sort of contact. So I posted this on Facebook. I said, does anyone know what this is? And I got a response from Kevin Han Yi right away. He said, oh, that's in the such and such laundry in Santa Barbara. And he has a cousin who also identified it, so that was an interesting discovery. It's a very rare photograph. Now, in 1869 in the South, in Memphis, there was a convention of plantation owners, cotton growers, and they were talking about what to do about the shortage of labor now that slavery had been ended in the mid-1860s. And so they thought, Cornelius Koopman thought, well, we'll look at these Chinese, we know that they're good, hard workers. So that was the plea for that. He said, we got these Chinese, what are we going to do with them? We're going to send them to the South. Okay, that's the solution to the Chinese problem. And this is just a newspaper article talking about in Memphis in June of 1869 at the convention of these cotton growers or Chinese these cotton plantation places. They said, well, let's go and recruit these Chinese. Well, as it turned out, the Chinese didn't do very well. And some people complained that they didn't work as hard as the slaves had worked. In any case, it was a failure. So even though there was that movement, that did send some Chinese to Arkansas, some to Mississippi, and some of their descendants are still there. So that opened a different kind of business of self-employment for Chinese, especially in the South. This one's in Greenville, Mississippi. So could be that in the South, grocery stores might have been more successful. This is just a conjecture. The Chinese knew their customers better than the white grocery stores did. For one notable example, I know for a fact that a lot of these Chinese grocers would extend credit to their black customers because their stores were mom and pop stores located often in black neighborhoods. So there was a proximity and a sort of a personal contact in that sense. If you went to the Piggly Wiggly, which was like the equivalent of Ralph's, I guess, in the South, and you wanted to get your food on credit, they'd laugh you out of it. You're not going to get any credit now. So that could be one contribution. So the Deep South and Southwest, for that matter, there were, it's not to say there were no Chinese grocers in other parts of the country, but it was a higher percentage of the Chinese in these areas that were running grocers. They also did laundries, but like in Augusta, for example, there were very few laundries, but a lot of a lot of grocery stores. So this is a typical, maybe, they had large families in Mississippi. The more children you have, the more people you put to work, which they almost unanimously resented, but all later thought well of it. That had been a good experience. It's in the Delta. I think I skipped one in Augusta. But, this is another one. You can see it's in the black neighborhood. And this is in Savannah. Okay, so the next third most important business that came along was starting, certainly after 1900, but there were a few a little bit earlier than that. This illustration is a bit of a cheat. It actually comes from Australia, but it serves to make the point. And the early Chinese restaurant was, obviously, just kind of a little hole in the wall, just kind of a primitive place where, travelers could go and get food. But restaurants were not all that popular, early on. Whites were unfamiliar with Chinese food. They thought it smelled bad. They thought it was, not as good as, meat and potatoes. But as we see, Chinese restaurants grew and grew and grew. Why did this occur? What was behind all this? You say, well, before families were allowed to come over or be created in the United States Chinatowns, streets were like this. These men all lived in very crowded quarters. They didn't have kitchen privileges. They had to go and eat out. So I've captioned this. This is one interpretation. These people are all your potential customers for a Chinese restaurant. And so a Chinese restaurant might look something like this, They didn't have to go to a white restaurant where they might not be welcome. Here, they can, feel quite at home, and it's kind of a hangout. It's what I call the forerunner of Starbucks, with a cheaper price. So this is where, like in Chinatown, a lot of Chinese could hang out in a place like this. Now, as I said, if you look at the media in that time, the general population did not think favorably about Chinese food. In this depiction, we can see that these children are bringing their pets to the restaurant, not to serve, but to be served. This is a racist kind of cartoon, and the title of the thing was called "You Want Tails with That?" As you can see, the guy in the front supposedly is Chinese, but he doesn't know how to use chopsticks. So this is again a way of sort of, well, they're all using chopsticks the same way. Now, the amazing thing that people don't seem to realize is that this transformation of acceptance of Chinese food is highly credited to chop suey, which I think most of us would not rank it very high on our list when we're going to order. So why would chop suey, such a pedestrian dish, be responsible for this? It shows the power of mass media, basically. What happened was a celebrity who was a high-ranking Chinese diplomat came to New York and Philadelphia in the late 1890s. And presumably, he had gone to a restaurant, a Chinese restaurant, unannounced, and wanted Chinese food. He was missing Chinese food. So the cook, not having any ingredients left because it's the end of the day, quickly went and scrounged and got all the cuttings from previous dishes, threw them all together in a wok, scrambled them up, and chowed them all up, served them. And the news reporters who were all there asked him, how did you like it? He said, it's pretty good. And he said, well, what is it? And they said, it's chop suey. And so they wrote chop suey. And then AP, the equivalent AP, circulated this all around the country. If you look at newspaper archive, you'll see this got announced everywhere. And so the yuppie, white food yuppies, felt like we had to go to Chinatown to try this out. Now, what is this thing called chop suey? So they would go, because Chinatown is a dangerous place at night, especially dark, Tong wars, prostitution, opium. So they would go, and the actual newspapers called it, going to Chinatown, and sort of like this was like an adventure for them. And so that sort of put Chinese food on the map. But nonetheless, even after that, the honeymoon with chop suey was soon over, and they got back to berating Chinese restaurants, making fun of chop suey. So there's the one about the Chinese running restaurants and white women. The laws of morality have been broken. The Chinese are mixing the sin with their chop suey. And here's an ad for a Seattle restaurant. The point I want you to make is in the middle. It says, no Chinese employed about the house. This was the virtue of this restaurant.
Microphone.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I need to hang it around my neck. Be carried away. All right, so in the hinterlands, let me just give you a couple of examples of hinterland connections here. There were three brothers in Massachusetts, in Holyoke, Massachusetts. Joe King, Joe Nam, and Joe Guai. And they ran laundry. And they heard of opportunity that somebody from their clan in Mississippi was retiring and leaving, Joe Gao knew. And so they decided, laundry is hard work. Let's go down to Mississippi and run a grocery store. So two of the brothers go down, one stays. Joe Guai stays for a few more years. And then eventually they go down, and then some of the original other people retire, and they send their sons and children to come. So that was like the interconnectedness of all this. You had relatives coming in, bringing other relatives, some of them paper sons, some of them maybe uncles, brothers, but they came in with false documents, whether they were paper sons or paper brothers or whatever. And that was the linkage. And this general point is applicable to all those other people got into the hinterland. Once they got there, they were the anchors. They were the ones who could try to send other people there. So some guy from China who comes over, he didn't have a clue where Greenville, Mississippi is. But he has a relative there who says, here's instructions. This is what you do. This is how you get here. You come here, I'll take you in, I'll feed you, I'll house you until you get established. One other interesting thing, this is a very busy diagram. I'm just going to focus on the middle. I discovered, to my surprise, I'm sure it would probably been a surprise, but there were amazing amount of itineracy among these. I don't mean that in a bad way, but migratory. So like one guy started out in a laundry in Boston. He then goes and works in a restaurant in Chicago. Then he works in a restaurant in Detroit. Then he goes to Duncan, Mississippi. All right, so he's moving around. Our next guy starts out working on the railroad in Mexico. Then he goes to Traverse City, Michigan. Then he goes to in a laundry. Then he does a laundry in Illinois. And then he ends up in the grocery store in Arkansas. And the third family, and all these people are interconnected after a while because their children kind of marry, across families. So the guy starts out on a farm, works in a cannery, he works in a restaurant in Colorado, then he works in a restaurant in Minnesota, then North Dakota, and then he ends up down in Round Pond, Arkansas. So why did these people move around so much? partly because they were always in search of another job, because jobs weren't always stable. You couldn't necessarily count on, once you got a job, you got that job for life. They may fire you, or they run out of business. So they're gravitating and moving around, and I was kind of surprised initially because I was biased by the fact that my father almost never moved. I mean, he came, got settled, and then he went to Georgia, and he stayed there his whole life, virtually, until we moved to California when he retired. So I was kind of looking out of that framework, and I started noticing that in all these records, it was more common than not for a lot of the early immigrants to be drifting, and not in a bad sense, but like seeking work. So go back to where I started. That here I am in Macon, Georgia, and that's our laundry. We lived above the laundry. And in Georgia, it gets very hot and very humid in summer. The one place you don't want to live is in those 3 windows, those 3 rooms above the laundry. You do not worry about being cold at night, I can tell you that. So, this is how it looked in 1906 or something. So on the far right of the building with the 3 little windows, that's the same one that I showed you before. I'm going to look back and see. Those 3 windows above Sam Lee Laundry are the same 3. Now, I didn't know this at the time, okay? In fact, when I was there, I never thought, it never entered my mind to ask, were there ever any Chinese in Macon before our family was there? No, I didn't. I was a kid, I didn't care about that. That would be the last thing to enter my mind. And I started doing this research. I found this in the Georgia archives, this photograph of a postcard. And I looked at that, and I said, oh my God, that sign there was the same one. I think every Chinese person who came there just repainted it, They never changed anything. And subsequently, I found out that building had been occupied by Chinese as a laundry as early as 1885, which was some 50 years before my father came there. However, when I went back in 2004, it was gone. They had knocked down the whole thing. I was really upset. Not that it was such a great place to live, but it was still home sweet home. That's where I grew up. And so I'm standing right where the laundry would have been. They knocked the whole thing down and made it into a parking lot. I went back a couple of years after that, and I found they had improved it. They built a parking structure instead of asphalt. So anyway, there was still some hope. So this is a very busy diagram, but I'll focus on the middle. My great-great-grandfather in China, Sun Bei, had 9 sons. And 2 in the middle, one of them went to Chattanooga, one of them went to Birmingham, and one on the far right of his grandsons went to Augusta. Now, I had heard from my mother as a child that my father had first gone to Chattanooga for a few years when he first came over as a single man. And then subsequently he went to Augusta for a few years. And it was registered in the back of my mind, but I didn't know why he went there or who he knew. Turns out that he went to there because he had relatives. These people were anchors for him. Gan Hong in Chattanooga and Gan Hong in Augusta, both laundrymen. They were part of his kinship. And the one in the far left, the one in Chattanooga, he had 2 sons, Hay and Poi. As it turns out, I eventually met Poi many years later. I never had been to Chattanooga, I only been to Augusta once. So this family tree is kind of complicated, but I'll try to hit the highlights. So my sister got really interested in genealogy and went and got the family tree. The family tree kept rolling up, so I couldn't read it, so I got my dog to help me. And so I was able to make some real progress once he got there. You can see his smug look. He probably wants a biscuit. All right, so my father had this grand uncle in Chattanooga and one in Augusta that I just alluded to before. So this could tell me that my father went to Chattanooga in 1921 because his grand uncle sponsored him or had him come there. His other grand uncle brought him to Augusta for a few years. And then in 1928, he went back to China for an arranged marriage with my mother. And then when they got married, they came to Macon, and they were the only Chinese laundry, as I said, and the only Chinese people there until they left in the 1950s. So this question still remains, who brought those granduncles, those two granduncles? See, you can't have to go back further and further. My father would have never gotten there without his granduncles. Well, how did his granduncles get there? You know, you keep going back and back and back. So the further you go back, the shakier the ground is. So I have to speculate a little bit. Now, I'm thinking that the Chattanooga granduncle may have worked on the Alabama-Chattanooga Railroad that exists. There's documents that show that some of the men who worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, after it was finished, they went down to Texas and worked on the Houston and Texas Central Railroad. And with that finished, some of them went to Meridian, Mississippi, which was the terminus of the Alabama and Chattanooga Railroad, which only lasted a few years because it went bankrupt. So I'm thinking that maybe, just maybe, my granduncle, my father's granduncle in Chattanooga, or some relative of his, had been one of those railroad workers. And when the Alabama-Chattanooga Railroad got to Chattanooga and died, he probably said, well, I better do something. Well, I'll go work in this laundry. So that's what I just said. And then, okay, so that's conjecture, but so, you know, I can't prove that, but I don't have any other hypothesis. I know that my father got there because his granduncle brought him, but I can't prove how his granduncle got there. But I have to think that he could not have gotten off the boat in San Francisco and said, oh, I think I'll go to Chattanooga. So it's interesting how I even found out about this granduncle connection. I mean, there are a lot of these crazy little things that happen. One day I discovered that there's some guy in San Francisco named Leland Wong. Well, no, actually I didn't discover that not quite that way. There was a Chinese guy in San Francisco who had found his father's name in one of my books. And he called and wanted to know how I knew his father. So I said, well, I'm going to be in San Francisco that very same day. I'm leaving on the plane in a couple of hours. So we'll get together at my brother's house and we'll go and look at these things. So it turns out this guy's name is Leland Wong, which was kind of funny because I knew another Leland Wong in San Francisco who was a photographer who was very well known in San Francisco Chinatown. He's like a Pied Piper of San Francisco Chinatown. So he looked at a shirt that I was wearing that Leland Wong had given me for Chinese New Year. He said, oh, you know Leland Wong? And I said, yeah. He said, my name's Leland Wong too. I said, really? And he said, yeah, we know each other. We have accounts at the same bank. Our accounts get mixed up and so forth. So it's really kind of crazy. But so anyway, the second Leland Wong, the one that I had just met for the first time, his father, which was on my chart, Poi, his father had been in Chattanooga. That was Gan Hong. And when Poi's, I guess it's not, when his father retired, he actually moved to San Francisco. And by just sheer chance, he opens a laundromat like 6 blocks down the same street that my mother opened a laundromat. Now, how spooky is that? So anyway, we got to talking, and to make a long story short, Leland told me about this other guy from Chattanooga, Jimmy Yee. And I said, Jimmy Yee, I know him. I used to play basketball with him at Cameron House in San Francisco. So it gets weirder and weirder. So anyway, he gives me the phone number for this guy. And what I got out of this was he sent me a photograph of the granduncle who brought my father over. This is the first time I'd ever seen this. I mean, I've never met the man, but it's sort of like, it put everything kind of together a little bit, even though, you know, it could be not correct, but nonetheless, I found it kind of fascinating as a personal discovery about, like, not only about my own family, but generalizing. There must be thousands of other Chinese who ended up in the hinterlands with some variation of the path that my father took. So I like to end a lot of my history talks with three of my favorite quotes, because I've come to appreciate the value of studying this history more and more. I was never interested in history that much when I was a kid or even in school. And this is a famous quote from the philosopher George Santayana, and then from the novelist William Faulkner. So that gives you an overview of the hinterland history. We tend to focus mostly on the Chinese on the west coast or on the east coast, but there's this whole unknown history about a lot of the Chinese in the Midlands. Okay, thank you. If you have questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.